Well, hello. I'm going to be starting shortly at 7 o'clock is the official start time, but I'm going to be testing audio and various other things now, just in case. So bear with me. Again, we will start at 7 o'clock. I hope that you can't hear the mouse clicking as I scroll. That would be a little unfortunate. We have one viewer. Hopefully that isn't just me. I don't know how this works very well, but if we do have a viewer, thank you for coming. Good. Susan, thank you. Audio is working. I'm glad of that. Last time I had some trouble with that. As long as you can hear me clearly, I'm happy. Last time, I don't know if people have any familiarity with Facebook Live, but last time I couldn't see anybody's comments as they were commenting, but this time I can, so whatever happened differently, I like that I can get feedback. So we have 2 people watching now, so welcome. Again, we will, yes, woo. I'm glad I can read comments this time. I don't know why that didn't work before. But again, I'm just gonna dawdle a bit until 7, and then we will start. The reading should take just under an hour, and it is an abridged version of the book The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And afterwards, if people want to stick around, I will briefly just talk about the book, my thoughts on it, and what it means. But yeah, so again, we'll start at 7. Just delaying. Well, have either of you read The Time Machine before, or seen either of the movies that were made? I saw the movie that was made in the 60s, but apparently one was made in the early 2000s as well, which I haven't seen that one, but from what I have heard, I don't think it sticks very true to the book. The 60s version does deviate from the book as well, but not as much. Yes, that is true. Weena did nothing wrong. I agree with that statement. I do feel sorry for Weena. Read the book a while back, good stuff, but I did watch the trailer for the 60s show last night. Okay. Yes, the 60s one I do very much like, although I haven't seen it in a long time. So maybe it's just nostalgia. But I recall liking it. There were certain parts that were in that movie that I expected to have in the book, but they were actually added. And so it was a little bit disappointing for me in that sense, because I had liked certain scenes. But maybe if I had read the book first and then watched the movie, I would have a different opinion. But here we are. So the movie does benefit from taking place in the 60s, meaning after both world wars had occurred, whereas the book was written in 1895, thus pre both world wars, and so it didn't have that same perspective coming into it. It didn't have the idea that global war was a possibility. So again, since it was in the 60s, they dealt with the idea of nuclear war, where the book obviously does not, because that wasn't a concept. All right, So it is now 7. And I'm gonna we'll begin reading shortly, but I am going to dawdle just a tad, just to see if we can get some more people to show up. But not too long. So, yeah, the book of, well, H.G. Wells is kind of classic author of the sci-fi genre. So one of the early writers of sci-fi. Obviously, there have been books about time travel before him, but this is kind of in the modern era. Even though it was the end of the 19th century, it still has a lot of the same tones and stuff of the modern sci-fi genre. And The Time Machine is one of his more famous works, although all of his works are pretty famous. So, as I said, it was written in 1895, and I will talk about that more at the end, because there's a lot of themes about the time period he wrote it in, because it was very much a social critique of his era. So, which is kind of the point of science fiction, in that it is to commentate on the current climate and where they believe the world is headed, especially in a time traveling book. All right. Well, we actually lost somebody, so now we're down to 1. But I'm going to start anyway. So thank you for joining me, and thank you to those who will be joining as we go on. But let's begin. So, H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. The time traveler was expounding to us a matter. His gray eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually gray face was flushed and animated. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert 1 or 2 ideas that are almost universally accepted. Yet I shall not ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. It's a thing of mere abstraction. Well, that's right, said the psychologist. Nor, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have a real existence. Well, here I object, said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. Of course, a solid body may have existence. So many people think. But wait a moment. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, said the time traveler, any real body must have extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousnesses move in one direction along the latter from the beginning to the end of our lives. Scientific people, continued the time traveler, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was high, yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any dimensions of space generally recognized, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, must be along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a 4th dimension of space, why cannot we move in time as we move about in other dimensions of space? The time traveler smiled. Are you sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backwards and forwards freely enough. But how about up and down? Gravity limits us there. Well, there are balloons, said the medical man. But before balloons, man had no freedom over vertical movement. They could go up and down a little, said the medical man, but you cannot move in time at all. You cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. Our mental existence are passing along the time duration with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the earth. As the civilized man is better off than the savage against gravity, as we can go up in balloons, why should we not hope that ultimately we may be able to stop or accelerate this drift along the time dimension? Oh, this, began Philby. Well, it's against reason. You can show black is white by argument, but you will never convince me. Possibly not, said the time traveler. But now you begin to see the object of my investigation into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago, I had a vague inkling of a machine that shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time. Philby contented himself with laughter. But I have experiment verification, said the time traveler. Well, let's see your experiment, said the psychologist, though it's all humbug, you know. The time traveler produced a small device of glittering metallic framework. On a table, he placed the mechanism. Then the time traveler pointed to a little white lever in the odd twinkling device and said, "This lever, being pressed over, sends the machine gliding into the future, and this other reverses the motion. Presently, I'm going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into the future time, and disappear." We all saw the lever turn. There was a breath of wind, and the lamp flame jumped. The little machine suddenly swung around, became indistinct, and then was gone, vanished. Everyone was silent for a moment. The psychologist suddenly looked under the table, and at that the time traveler laughed cheerfully. We stared at each other. Look here, said the medical man. Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that machine has traveled into time? Certainly, said the time traveler, lighting his pipe and looking each of us in the face. What is more, I believe I have a big machine nearly finished in my laboratory, and when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. And, taking a lamp in his hand, he led us the way down the long corridor to his laboratory, where we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism we had seen vanish before our eyes. Upon that machine, said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Well, none of us quite knew how to take it. I think at the time none of us believed in the time machine. For my own part, I remember discussing with the medical man about the trick of the model. He said he had seen something similar done by a magician. The next Thursday, I went again to the time traveler's house. Arriving late, I found 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man looked at his watch. Well, it's 7:30 now, he said. I suppose we'd better have dinner. I looked around for the time traveler and questioned where he was. It's rather odd, said the medical man. He asked me in a note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not here. Says he'll explain when he comes. Well, he was in the midst of ringing the bell when the door from the corridor opened and the time traveler stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. His coat was dirty and smeared with green down, his hair disordered, and, as it seemed to me, grayer. His face was ghastly pale. His expression was haggard and drawn. For a moment, he hesitated in the doorway. Then he came into the room with such a limp. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass and the time traveler drained it. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the medical man. "Where's my mutton?" said the time traveler. "I won't say a word until I get something to eat. Thank you. And the salt." "One word," said I. "Have you been time traveling?" "Yes," said the time traveler with his mouth full. Then he devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. At last he pushed his plate away. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving. I will tell you of what happened to me, if you like. Most of it will sound like lying. So be it. It's true, every word of it." And with that, the time traveler began his story as I have set it forth. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will happen next as I felt then. But I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping in the other, pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, but looking around, I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Then I noted the clock. A moment before it had stood at just past 10. Now it was nearly 3:30. My machine had worked. I drew a breath, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. I'm afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. There's a feeling of helpless, headlong motion. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky. In the intermittent darknesses, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from noon to full, and presently, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous grayness. I saw on the hillside trees growing like puffs of vapor. I saw huge buildings rising up, faint and fair, and pass like dreams. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time. And then I saw a richer green flow up the hillside and remain there without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed fair, and so my mind came round to the business of stopping. Yet, like an impatient fool, I lugged over the lever, and there was the sound of a clap of thunder, and I may have been stunned for a moment, but when I awoke, a pitiless hail was hissing round me, and I was sitting on soft turf in front of my own overturned machine. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in the garden. The dancing hail hung in a cloud over me, and in a moment I was wet to the skin. As the columns of hail grew thinner, I saw a colossal figure, carved in white marble, looming beyond the garden. It was in the shape something like a sphinx. The pedestal it rested on was bronze. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imported an unpleasant suggestion of disease. As I looked, the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What if, in this interval, the race of man had developed into something unsympathetic and overwhelmingly cruel? I was seized with a sudden panic. I turned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to right it. As I did, the shafts of the sun smote through the thunderstorm. The gray downpour was swept aside above me, and there was the intense blue sky of the summer. Great buildings stood about me. I took a breathing space and again fiercely grappled with the machine. I gave under my desperate onset and turned over. I had one hand on the handle, the other on the saddle, but I stood panting heavily, in a mood to mount again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I looked more curiously at this world of the remote future. Then I heard voices approaching. Coming through the bushes were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic. He struck me as being a very beautiful and gracious creature, but incredibly frail. He came straight up to me and laughed into my eyes. The absence from his bearing any sign of fear struck me at once. Then he turned to the other two who were following him and spoke to them in a very strange and very sweet liquid tongue. Presently, a little group of these exquisite little creatures were about me. One of them addressed me, and it came into my mind that my voice was too harsh and deep for them, so I just shook my head and pointed to my ears. He then came forward and touched my hand. Then I felt another soft hand upon my back and shoulders. They wanted to make sure I was real. It was altogether delightful, but I made a sudden motion to warn them when I saw their pink hands feeling at the time machine. I thought then of a danger I had hitherto forgotten, and I unscrewed the little levers that would set the machine in motion and put these in my pockets. Then I turned again to see what I could do in the way of communication. Wondering how to express time, I pointed to the sun. At once a pretty little figure followed my gesture, and then astonished me by imitating the sound of thunder. Well, for a moment I was staggered. You see, I had anticipated that the people of the future would be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, and, well, everything. Then one of them asked me if I had come from the sun in a thunderstorm. A flow of disappointment rushed across my mind. I nodded. Then they came laughing towards me, carrying a chain of beautiful flowers, and put it around my neck. Then I was led towards a vast gray edifice of fretted stone. The building had a huge entry and was altogether colossal in dimensions, but very badly broken and weather-worn. The big doorway opened into a proportionally great hall where innumerable tables were heaped with fruits. Between the tables were cushions, and upon these my conductors seated themselves, signing me to do likewise. I was not loath to follow, for I felt hungry. Fruit, by the by, was their diet. Indeed, I found afterwards that horses, cattle, sheep, dogs, they had all followed the ichthyosaurus into extinction. But the fruits were very delightful. So soon as my appetite was checked, I determined to make a resolute attempt to learn the speech of these new men. The fruit seemed a convenient thing to begin upon, and holding one of these up, I began a series of interrogative sounds and gestures. I had considerable difficulty, but presently a fair-haired creature repeated a name. My first attempt to make the exquisite little sound caused an immense amount of amusement. Presently I had a score of noun substantives at my command, but it was slow work, and the little people soon tired and wanted to get away from my interrogations. It was odd. My little hosts would come to me with eager cries of astonishment, like children, but, like children, they would stop examining me pretty soon and wander off to find some other toy. The calm of evening was upon the world as I emerged the great hall. I resolved to mount to the summit of a crest from which I could get a wider view of this our planet. As I did, I saw many vast structures, yet all in crumpled heaps. Indeed, all the world was in a condition of ruinous splendor. Looking around with a sudden thought, I realized that there were no small houses to be seen. Communism, said I to myself. And on the heels of that thought came another. I looked at the little figures that were following me. All had the same form of costume, the same hairless, soft visage, and in all differences of texture that now mark off the sexes from each other, these people of the future were alike. Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that this close resemblance of the sexes was what one would expect. For the strength of a man and the softness of a woman are mere militant necessities of an age of violence. In a secure world, there is less necessity for specialization of the sexes. We see some beginnings of this even now in our own time. Towards the top of the hill, I found a seat of some yellow metal I didn't recognize. I sat down and surveyed the broad view of our world. Here and there rose a white or silvery figure in the vast garden of the earth, similar to the Sphinx that was near my lawn. There were no hedges, no signs of property rights, no evidence of agriculture. It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity in its wane. For the first time, I began to recognize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we are presently engaged. Strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. Even in our own time, there's a sentiment arising, and it will grow, against connubial jealousy, against fierce maternity, against passion of all sorts. In that time, all these were unnecessary things, discords in a refined and pleasant life. Even in our own time, certain tendencies, once necessary to survive, are a constant source of failure. Physical courage and love of battle, for instance, are no great help to a civilized man. And in a state of balance, power, intellectual as well as physical, would be out of place. This has ever been the fate of energy and security. It takes to art and to eroticism, and then comes languor and decay. We are kept keen on the grindstone of pain and necessity, and it seemed to me that here was that hateful grindstone broken at last. So as I stood there musing over this too perfect triumph of man, the full moon came up, and I determined to descend and find where I could sleep. I looked for the building I knew. My eyes traveled along for the figure of the white Phoenix. And there was the little lawn. Yet I looked at the lawn again and grew chill. The time machine. The time machine was gone. At once, like a lash across the face, came the possibility of being left helpless in this strange new world. In an instant, I was in a passion of fear and running with great leaping strides down the slope. When I reached the lawn, my worst fears were realized. Not a trace of the thing was to be seen. Sobbing and raving in mind and anguish, I went down to the great building of stone. I lit a match and found a score or so of the little people sleeping. I have no doubt they found my second appearance strange enough, coming suddenly out of the quiet darkness with inarticulate noises. "Where is my time machine?" I began, laying hands upon them, shaking them up. Some laughed. Most of them looked sorely frightened. It came into my head that I was doing as foolish a thing as it was possible. They could not understand me. But I dashed out, went blundering into the moonlight. I have a memory of horrible fatigue, of looking in this impossible place and that, of groping around among moonlight ruins, and at last of lying on the ground near the Sphinx and weeping with absolute wretchedness. And then I slept, and when I woke again, it was full day. But with the day, I could see the wild folly of my frenzy overnight, and I could reason with myself. I made a careful examination of the ground about the lawn. I wasted some time in futile questioning, but the little people failed to understand my gestures. The turf gave better counsel than they did, and I found a groove ripped in it, about midway between the pedestal and the Sphinx. This directed my attention closer to the pedestal. It was no mere block, but had deep-framed panels on either side. Wrapped on these, the pedestal was hollow. It took no great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside, but how to get there was a different problem. I saw two little people coming towards me. I turned, smiled at them, pointed to the pedestal, and tried to imitate my wish to open it. But at my first gesture towards this, they behaved very oddly, as if they had received the last possible insult. I tried with the next passerby with the exact same result, as with the third. But I was not beaten. I got a big rock and hammered on the bronze panel till I was hot and tired. Yet it did not give, and so at last I sat down to watch the place. I got up after a time and began walking aimlessly through the bushes. I determined to put the thought of my time machine as much as possible in the corner of my memory, until my growing knowledge would lead me back in a natural way. I returned to pushing my explorations here and there. As far as I could see, all the world displayed the same exuberant richness. From every hill I saw the same abundance of splendid buildings and the same clustering of thickets of evergreens. A peculiar feature which presently attracted my attention was the presence of certain wells of a great depth. Sitting by the side of these, I could see no gleam of water, but in all of them I heard the sound like the beating of some big engine. After a time, I came to connect these wells with tall towers standing upon the slopes, for above them there was just such a flicker in the air as one sees on a hot day over a sun-scorched beach. Putting things together, I reached a strong suggestion of an extensive system of subterranean ventilation, whose true import it was difficult to imagine. Yet I had a friend of a sort on that third day in the future. It happened that, as some of the little people were bathing in a shallow, one of them was seized with a cramp and began drifting downstream. And none of the delicate creatures made the slightest attempt to rescue the weakly crying little thing, which was drowning right before their eyes. When I realized this, I hurriedly waded in at a lower point and caught the poor mite and drew her safe to land. I had such a low estimate of her kind that I did not expect any gratitude from her. Later that day, however, I met my little woman as I was returning towards the lawn I had first arrived in. She received me with cries of delight and presented me with a big garland of flowers. I did my best to display my appreciation of the gift, and engaging in conversation consisting chiefly of smiles, I eventually found that her name was Weena. She was exactly like a child. She tried to follow me everywhere, and when her fragile frame failed to keep up, she called after me rather plaintively. I had not come into the future to carry on a miniature flirtation, yet her distress when I left her was very great. And she was, somehow, a very great comfort for me, for by merely seeming fond of me, the little doll of a creature presently gave my return to the lawn almost the feeling of coming home. But my story slips away from me as I speak of her. I must have been the night before her rescue that I was awakened about dawn. The moon was setting, and the dying moonlight cast a ghastly half-light. And up the hill I thought I could see a solitary, ape-like creature running. It moved hastily and seemed to vanish among the bushes. The dawn was still indistinct, you must understand, so I doubted my eyes. I think I've said how much hotter than our own was the weather of the Golden Age. It may be that the sun was hotter, or the earth nearer the sun, whatever the reason. One very hot morning, as I was seeking shelter from the heat in a colossal ruin, I found a narrow gallery whose end and side windows were blocked by fallen masses of stone. By contrast with the brilliancy outside, it seemed at first impenetrably dark to me. I entered it groping, and suddenly I halted spellbound. A pair of eyes, luminous by reflection, was watching me out of the darkness. I was afraid to turn, so I advanced a step and spoke. At once the eyes darted sideways, and something white ran past me. I turned with my heart in my mouth and saw a queer little ape-like figure running across the sunlit space behind me. In a moment, it was hidden in a black shadow beneath another pile of ruined masonry. After an instant's pause, I followed it into the second heap of ruins and came upon one of those wells of which I have told you. Could this thing have vanished down the shaft? Well, I lit a match and, looking down, saw a small white creature regarding me steadfastly as it retreated. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider. It was clambering down a number of metal foot and hand rests I had not before noticed. Then, into darkness, the creature vanished. Well, it was not for some time that I could succeed in persuading myself that the thing I had seen was human. But gradually the truth dawned on me that man had not remained one species. I wondered what part this lemur played in my scheme of a perfectly balanced organization. As I hesitated, absolutely afraid to descend the well for a solution, two of the beautiful upper-world people came running in their amorous sport across the daylight into the shadow. They seemed distressed to find me appearing down the well, and when I pointed to it and tried to frame a question, they were still more distressed and turned away. So here was my new theory of the future. Beneath my feet, the earth must be tunneled enormously, and these tunnelings were the habitat of the new race. It seemed clear to me that the gradual widening of the present social differences between the capitalist and the laborer was the root of this future divide. No doubt it will seem wildly incredible to you, and yet even now there is a tendency to utilize underground space for the less ornamental purposes of civilization. Evidently, this tendency had increased till industry had lost its birthright in the sky. So in the end, above ground you must have the haves, and below ground the have-nots. The great triumph of humanity I had dreamed of took a different shape in my mind. It had not been triumph of moral education and general cooperation. Instead, I saw a real aristocracy triumphing over its fellow man. The next night I did not sleep well. I felt assured that the time machine had been taken by the Morlocks. That, by the by, was the name of the undergrounders. They were called the Morlocks. After 2 days, I built my nerve and resolved to make the descent underground to face the mystery there. And then little Weena ran with me. She danced beside me to the well, but when she saw me lean over it, she seemed strangely disconcerted. "Goodbye, little Weena," I said, kissing her. Then I began to feel over the parapet for the climbing hooks. Weena gave a most piteous cry and, running to me, began to pull at me with her little hands. I shook her off, and in another moment I was in the throat of the well. I saw her agonized face over the parapet, and I smiled to reassure her, but it did not. I had to clamber down a shaft of perhaps 200 yards. Then one of the bars suddenly bent under my weight, and for a moment I hung by one hand. And after that experience, I did not dare rest again. Glancing upwards, I saw the aperture, a small blue disk that was the sky, while little Weena's head showed as a round black projection. The thudding sound of a machine below grew louder and more oppressive. At last, I saw a slender loophole in the wall. Swinging myself in, I found it was the aperture of a narrow tunnel in which I could lie down and rest. It was not too soon. My arms ached, and I was trembling with the prolonged terror of the fall. I do not know how long I lay, but I was roused by a soft hand touching my face. Starting up in the darkness, I snatched at my matches and, hastily striking one, saw 3 stooping creatures hastily retreating before the light. I tried to call to them, but the language they had was apparently different from the upper world people. Pressing on and striking another match, I saw that I had entered an arched cavern. Some way down the central vista was a little table laid with what seemed to be a meal. By the heavy smell of freshly shed blood, I knew the Morlocks were, at any rate, carnivorous. Then the match burned down and stung my fingers and fell wriggling red in the blackness. I was afraid to push my way forward in the dark, and it was only with my last glimpse of light I discovered that my store of matches was reduced to 4. Then, while I stood in the dark, a hand touched mine. Lank fingers came feeling over my face. I shouted at the creatures as loud as I could, but they were not seriously alarmed and made a queer laughing noise. I will confess I was horribly frightened. I determined to strike another match and escape under the protection of its glare. I did so and made good my retreat to the narrow tunnel, but I had scarce entered this when my light was blown out, and in a moment I was clutched by several hands, and there was no mistaking that they were trying to haul me back. I struck another light and waved it in their dazzled faces. I retreated again, and when my second match ended, I struck my third. Then, as I reached out for the ladder, my feet were grasped, and I was violently tugged backward. I lit my last match, but it incontinently went out. I kicked violently and disengaged myself from the Morlocks. The one little wretch secured my boot as a trophy. At last I got over the top of the well mouth, somehow, and staggered out of the ruin into the blinding sunlight. I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelt sweet and clean. Then I remember Weena kissing my hands and ears. Then, for a time, I was insensible. I now understood the fear of the little upper world people. They may once have been the favored aristocracy, and the Morlocks their mechanical servants, but that had long since passed away. Thousands of generations ago, man had thrust his brother out of the ease and the sunshine. Now, that brother was coming back, changed. Without further delay, I determined to make myself arms, some means to break into the pedestal of the White Sphinx and retrieve my time machine. I had in mind a battering ram. I couldn't imagine the Morlocks were strong enough to move the time machine far away. I wandered further to find something of use. With one boot lost and the other with a nail working through the sole, I was made nearly lame. But some time past sunset, I saw a great palace, the structure of which being larger than anything else I had hitherto seen, and so I steered my steps towards it. Weena delighted in running along by the side of me. She occasionally darted off on either hand to pick flowers to stick in my pockets. My pockets had always puzzled her, you see, but at the last she had concluded that they were an eccentric kind of vase for floral decoration. Oh, and that reminds me. The time traveler paused, put his hand into his pocket, and silently placed 2 withered flowers upon the table. Then he resumed his narrative. So we went on in the quiet, and the twilight deepened into night. Weena's fears and fatigue grew upon her. I took her in my arms and talked to her and caressed her. Then, as darkness grew deeper, she put her arms around my neck and, closing her eyes, tightly pressed her face against my shoulder. From the brow of the hill, I saw a thick wood spreading wide and black before me. I was very tired, so I decided that I would pass the night upon the open hill. Weena, I was glad to find, was fast asleep. I carefully wrapped her in my jacket and sat down beside her. I looked above me to the stars. All the old constellations had gone from the sky. All I had ever known, even the mere memory of man as I knew him, had been swept out of existence. Indeed, instead, there were these frail creatures who had forgotten their high ancestry, and the white things of which I went in terror. Then I thought of the great fear that was between the 2 species, and for the first time came the clear knowledge of what type of meat the Morlocks might eat. Yet it was too horrible. I looked at little Weena sleeping beside me and forthwith dismissed the thought. I kept vigil that night, but no Morlocks approached. In the morning, we went down into the wood, now green and pleasant instead of black and foreboding. We found some fruit wherewith to break our fast, and I thought once more of the meat the Morlocks eat. Felt assured now of what it was. After all, what animals had I seen in that distant future? Clearly, at some time in the long ago of human decay, the Morlock's food had run short. His prejudice against human flesh is no deep-seated instinct, and so these inhuman sorts of men. I tried to look at the thing in a scientific spirit. The upper-worlders were mere fatted cattle, which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon. Yet there was Weena dancing at my side. I couldn't think of it anymore. I found the palace when we approached it at noon, deserted and falling into ruin. Within we found a long gallery lit by many side windows. The tiled floor was thick with dust, and a remarkable array of objects were shrouded in the same gray covering. Then I perceived what was clearly part of a huge skeleton of some extinct creature after the fashion of the Megatherium. Obviously, this was a museum. Going towards the side, I found the old familiar glass cases of our own time, but they must have been airtight to judge from the fair preservation of their content. Exploring, I found another short gallery running transversely to the first. This one appeared to be devoted to minerals. Sulfur hung in my mind, but I couldn't find any saltpeter. As for the rest of that gallery, I had little interest. Then we came to a gallery of colossal proportions. Rising on either side of me were the huge bulks of machines, all greatly corroded and many broken down. I was inclined to linger among these, but suddenly Weena came nervously to my side. I called to mind that it was far advanced in the afternoon, and I had still no weapon nor means of making fire. Turning to a machine, I leaned my weight against a projecting lever until it snapped. Now I had a mace in my hand. Well, mace in one hand and Weena in the other, I went out of that gallery and came to what may once have been a gallery of technical chemistry. I went eagerly to every unbroken case, and at last I found a box of matches. They were perfectly good. They weren't even damp. Yet far unlikelier than matches, I found camphor, perfectly preserved. I put this in my pocket and left the gallery greatly elated. We emerged from the palace while the sun was still in part above the horizon. My plan was to go as far as possible that night, and then, building a fire, sleep in the protection of its glare. Accordingly, as we went along, I gathered any sticks I saw. Thus loaded, our progression was slower than I anticipated, so it was full night before we reached the wood. I saw 3 crouching figures behind us. The forest, I calculated, was less than a mile across. If we could get through to the bare hillside, there was an altogether safer resting place. I thought that with my matches I could keep my path illuminated. Yet it was evident that if I was to flourish in matches, I would have to abandon my firewood. And then it came into my head that I would amaze my friends behind me by lighting this abandoned wood. So I started the fire, and for a little way the glare of it lit the path. Looking back, I could see that from my heap of sticks the blaze had spread to some bushes adjacent. I turned again to the dark trees before me. It was very black, and Weena clung to me convulsively. I pushed on grimly. Then I caught the same queer voices I had heard in the underworld. In another minute, I felt a tug at my coat, then something at my arm. It was time for a match. As I fumbled with my pocket, soft little hands began creeping over my coat and back, touching even my neck. Then the match scratched and fizzed. I held it flaring and saw the white backs of the Morlocks in flight amid the trees. I hastily took a lump of camphor from my pocket and, lighting it, flung it to the ground, driving back the Morlocks in the shadows. Then I looked at Weena. She was lying clutching my feet and quite motionless. She seemed to have fainted. I put her carefully upon my shoulder and rose to push on. Then came a horrible realization. In all my maneuvering, I had turned myself about several times and now had not the faintest idea which direction lay my path. I found myself in a cold sweat, so I determined to build a fire in the camp where I was. Hastily I collected sticks and leaves. Here and there, in the darkness round me, the Morlock's eyes shone. The camphor flickered and went out. I lit a match, and two white forms that had been approaching dashed away. Very soon I had a smoky fire and could economize my camphor. Then I tried to revive Weena, but she lay like one dead. My fire would not need replenishing for an hour or so. I was very weary, and I sat down. I seemed just to nod and open my eyes, but all was dark, and the Morlocks had their hands upon me. Flinging off their clinging fingers, I hastily felt in my pockets for the matchbox. It had gone. I was caught by the neck, by the hair, by the arms, and pulled down. I rolled over, and my hand came upon my iron lever. I struggled up, shaking the human rats from me, and holding the bar short, I thrust where I judged their faces might be. I could feel the giving of flesh and bone under my blows, and for a moment I was free. I stood with my back to a tree, swinging the iron bar before me. The whole wood was full of the stir and cries of them, yet none of them came within reach. Then the darkness seemed to grow luminous. Very dimly I began to see the Morlocks about me, and then I recognized with incredulous surprise that they were running. Stepping out from behind my tree, I saw through the black pillars of the nearer trees the flames of the burning forest. It was my first fire come after me. With that, I looked for Weena, but she was gone. The hissing and crackling behind me, the explosive thud of each fresh tree bursting into flame, left little time for reflection. My iron bar still gripped, I followed in the Morlock's path. It was a close race, but at last I emerged upon a small open space. This whole space was as bright as day, with the reflection of the fire. Yellow tongues already encircled the space with a fence of flame. Upon the hillside were some 30 Morlocks dazzled by the light and heat. I walked about the hill among them and avoided them, looking for some trace of Weena. But she was gone. For most of the night, I was persuaded it was some nightmare. I beat the ground with my hands and called upon God to let me wake. But at last, above the subsiding red of the fire, came the light of the day. I searched again for traces of Weena, but there were none. Yet I did regain my bearings, and so I limped on across smoking ashes towards the hiding place of the time machine. I walked slowly, for I felt the intensest wretchedness for the horrible death of little Weena. But as I walked, I made a discovery. In my trouser pocket were still some loose matches. I had those at the very least. About 8 in the morning, I came to the same seat from which I had first viewed the world. I understood now what all the beauty of the upper world people covered. I grieved to think how brief the dream of human intellect had been. It had committed suicide. Then I came on down the hill towards the White Sphinx. I had the lever in one hand, and the other hand played with the matches in my pocket. But now, as I came, a most unexpected thing. As I approached the pedestal, I found the bronze valves were open. Within was a small apartment, and in the corner was the time machine. I had the small levers in my pocket, so I stepped through the bronze frame and up to the time machine. Now, as I stood and examined it, the thing I had expected happened. The panels suddenly slid up and struck the frame with a clang. I was in the dark, trapped, so the Morlocks thought. At that, I chuckled. Very calmly, I tried to strike a match. I had only to fix on the levers and depart then like a ghost. But I had overlooked one little thing. The matches were of that abominable kind that only light on the box. The little brutes were close upon me. I began to scramble into the saddle of the machine. Then came one hand upon me, and then another. It was a nearer thing, that fight, than the one in the forest, I think, this last scramble. But at last I fitted the lever and pulled it. The clinging hand slipped from me. The darkness presently fell from my eyes. I found myself in the same gray light and the tumult I have already described. So I came back. I heard your voices and the clatter of plates. I hesitated. I felt so sick and weak. But then I sniffed good wholesome meat and opened the door on you. You know the rest. I know, he said after a pause, that all this will be absolutely incredible to you. No, I cannot expect you to believe it. Take it as a lie, or as a prophecy, and take it as a story. But what do you think? There was a moment of stillness. Then the editor stood up with a sigh. What a pity it is you're not a writer, he said. I'll be hanged if it isn't 1:15, said the journalist. Best we get home. But the medical man examined the withered flowers that the time traveler had produced. It's a curious thing, he said, but I certainly don't know the natural order of these flowers. Where did you really get them? The time traveler put his hand to his head. They were put into my pocket by Weena. He stared round at the room. The story I told you was true. The medical man looked into his face and, with a certain hesitation, told him he was suffering from overwork. Then we all left. I shared a cab with the editor. He thought the tale a gaudy lie. For my own part, I was unable to come to a conclusion. I lay awake most of the night thinking about it. I determined to go the next day and see the time traveler again. I was told he was in the laboratory, and, being on easy terms in the house, went up to him. As I took hold of the handle of the door, I heard an exclamation. A gust of air whirled around me as I opened the door. I seemed to see a ghostly, indistinct figure sitting in a whirling mass for a moment, but this phantasm vanished as I rubbed my eyes. The time traveler had gone. That I understood. I waited for the time traveler to return with tales, specimens, and photographs, but I am beginning to now fear that I must wait a lifetime. The time traveler vanished 3 years ago, you see, and as everyone knows, he has never returned. One cannot choose but wonder about this cheerless advancement of mankind, the suicide of civilization, as the time traveler called it. With all our striving, could it be that we are only foolishly heaping that which inevitably will fall back upon and destroy its maker? But, in the face of this black future, I have by me, for my comfort, 2 strange white flowers to witness that, even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude still lived on in the heart of man. And that is the end of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. So thank you for listening in. And as I said at the beginning, I will be now talking about my thoughts about The Time Machine. So if you do want to stick around, feel free. This will only take like 10 minutes or so. So H.G. Wells wrote this book in the late 19th century, the very, very end of the 19th century, so 1895. And so this was before both world wars and before the rise of communism in Soviet Russia and other places like that. So communism was still a very, very popular idea, which is why the book addresses that. as one of the main themes. So as he anticipates in the future, he says, he has that one line, it's like, communism, when he sees how the little people are living. But it's not just straight up and down pro-communist book, because it does mention it. There's a key little line where it says, man's too perfect triumph. So though H.G. Wells was an advocate for communism, he presented an idea that though communism would achieve perfection, societal perfection, perfection had its drawbacks in that, he has that whole saying where need is what inspires strength, both physical and intellectual. So if nobody is ever hungry, if there's no need for better housing, if everybody always has exactly what they need, then there's no reason to try harder. And if you're not trying harder, then there's no progression. So he argues then that eventually although it's a good idea to progress towards communism in his mind, eventually you'll reach a point where then it will circle back around, and mankind will wane and grow fatigued intellectually, physically, and then need will be reintroduced because of that, and then they'll have to rebuild and kind of start all over. But there's also plenty, even though he does have this critical view of the too perfectness of communism, there's still a very strong pro-communist mentality here, especially when he's talking about the differences between the upper world people and the underworld people. And he's saying, like, this divide came about because of the aristocracy. So, as he says, the haves and the have-nots, that divide continued to grow until you just have complete two different species. And the aristocracy, since it's living in this ideal perfection, will decay. As said before, when there's no need, there's no reason to strive to better yourself. Whereas the working class will still have need, and so they will be inevitably stronger, just like the Morlocks are stronger than the upper worlders. So, how, of course, though, he doesn't in the book side with the Morlocks. The Morlocks are still in the wrong in terms of cannibalism, and that's a pretty easy reason to see. But the one most interesting feature about it, because he does talk about, so it's the destructive path, as he says, of civilization that we are currently on, with the separation of the classes that will result in the Morlock little upper world people dilemma. But so as he describes it, our current social endeavors are committing suicide, because our efforts in building our civilization as it is will inevitably lead to its own destruction. So we are consciously choosing a path that will destroy us. But he then has, at the very end, one little line of hope, which he hints at ahead of time in the white flowers. So when the time traveler saves Weena, he said he had such a low impression of the little people that he didn't expect any gratitude. Because, I mean, after all, they didn't even try to save Weena when she was drowning right in front of them. So he didn't have a high opinion. But he turned out to be wrong in that sense. Weena was incredibly grateful and devoted the rest of her life to the time traveler because of this. And then at the end, we see that same concept brought up again when the narrator, so the H.G. Wells character, the first person speaker, points out that even when mind and strength are gone, gratitude remains. So there is this hope for humanity in terms of this kind of being able to be grateful for others, to appreciate each other, and to appreciate the deeds that other people do. So again, there's still this black uncertainty of the future, even in this sense, but there is the hope that even if things go on this disastrous route, that gratitude still survives, and in gratitude there is an aspect of humanity. So even though everything is destroyed, everything's wrong, humanity still exists in some small way. So from that gratitude, a society may be able to rebuild itself. So it is an ultimate optimistic story, although it is very much proclaiming the problems as H.G. Wells saw it with the current social situation, which was a large divide between the well, in modern terms, the 1% and the 99%. So it is very applicable to modern times. Not that the solution is necessarily communism. I mean, that can be a debate for another day, but it didn't work so well for Soviet Russia, I'll just say that. Not that they are the best example. But so even though whether we agree with his end result or not, we can agree with what he saw as a problem, and that is a growing divide. He thought, again, that it would continue to grow all the way until you had two separate species. Whether he literally thought that or he meant it as a metaphor, I'm more inclined to believe he thought of it as a metaphor, especially because, the lower class rising up to overthrow the aristocracy is very clearly mirrored in the Morlocks rising up to feast on the upper worlders. So yeah, a lot of still very modern themes. So it is very timely still. And again, you don't have to agree with his analysis or his solution. He doesn't really present too much of a solution, but it's still an interesting read. So, and hopefully an interesting listen. So I'm glad that you all stuck around, and hope to see you all next time. We will be doing another reading of another work sometime next month, probably the 18th of next month. And that will be in the summer. For our summer reading program is fantasy themed. So our next book will be the short story Farmer Giles of Ham by J.R.R. Tolkien. And if you are not familiar with the Farmer Giles of Ham, that's not surprising. It's one of his lesser known works because it's not within the same universe as The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, but it is a fun little short story, and I do highly recommend it. So I hope to see you all then. All right. Thanks again, and bye. If it will shut off.